The news department of Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles presents It Isn't Really War, a look at human rights in El Salvador in 1981. Since the fall of 1979, the U.S. government has become increasingly involved in El Salvador. It was then that a military coup displaced the prior military regime and promised that after 50 years of armed forces rule, the time had come to make basic social and political reforms. But within a few months, the moderate civilians that had initially supported the new junta had for the most part left the government, saying that power still remained in the hands of the military right wing. Popular dissent grew, so did the street demonstrations, and so did the repression and the consequent imprisonments and murders. But the United States stayed committed to that governing junta, saying it was a center force between the extreme right and the extreme left. As the peaceful channels for dissent were systematically sealed off, a guerrilla war burgeoned. Civil liberties were suspended. Curfew was imposed, so was martial law. The universities were closed. Fighting broke out throughout the country, and the United States nearly tripled its military assistance to El Salvador. Then, in early 1981, after a general offensive by the guerrillas left a number of rural areas outside of the control of the government, and even more military aid from the U.S. was being offered, the American ambassador to El Salvador, Robert White, spoke out against administration policy. He suggested that President Reagan was wrong in searching for a military solution to the problem, that negotiations and mediation might be a better way to solve the conflict. Robert White was then immediately fired by Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who announced that the new administration was drawing the line against revolution in the hemisphere right through El Salvador. The new U.S. ambassador to that country is Dean Hinton. Arriving in May of 1981, Hinton reaffirmed total U.S. support for the military government in El Salvador, and the ambassador says that the American people should be ready to support the Salvadorian junta because it is committed to improving its human rights record. This program focuses in on the current state of human rights in El Salvador. You'll hear Ambassador Hinton, as well as the Salvadorian Catholic Church and the El Salvador Human Rights Commission. The latter two agencies claim that never in history has the state of human rights been so dismal as it is today in El Salvador. The U.S. ambassador disagrees, saying things are only getting better. And the ambassador, interviewed by Pacifica Radio in San Salvador, argues that the Salvadorian junta, that only 1 month before decorated Chilean General Augusto Pinochet with a Medal of Honor, should be supported because it is in fact carrying out revolutionary reforms while at the same time serving as a bulwark against what the administration sees as an international plot to destabilize Central America. U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador, Dean Hinton.
The United States is supporting a revolutionary government in El Salvador, a government that is carrying out the most far-reaching reforms that anyone has tried in 50 years. In the agrarian reform section, turning land over to the campesinos, taking it away from others, which is a difficult business at best. A government that has nationalized the banking system, a government that has established national export marketing boards for their two principal exports, coffee and sugar. That government is under attack from what I would call Leninist forces, the extreme left, who are not satisfied with the reforms that are being carried out, and these revolutionary changes that have been carried out, under attack by the extreme left, supported by Havana and by countries that have close friendship with the Soviet Union. There are arms that are being used by the insurgents that have come from such unlikely places as Ethiopia, Bulgaria, Vietnam, to name just a few. And we are here to try to see that this government will not be overwhelmed by that kind of extreme leftist pressure directed by Havana and supported by Moscow.
In May of 1981, nearly 100,000 people demonstrated in Washington against U.S. involvement in El Salvador. The administration has been threatened with the violation of the War Powers Act because the Pentagon has sent more than 50 U.S. military advisors to El Salvador without congressional approval. El Salvador, as a new Vietnam, is not a popular cause in the United States. Consequently, the administration has begun to promise that the American-supported junta will soon organize free and democratic elections, maybe in 1982 or maybe in 1983. Once that is on the agenda, the guerrilla war will presumably disappear. Again, Ambassador Hinton.
Well, I'm hoping that the levels of violence will drop off. I'm hoping that the guerrillas, now that they see that they have no chance, will come back into the society and operate through traditional political means, participate in a political process, be citizens of El Salvador. That's one of the reasons why I think elections offer some hope for a peaceful political solution. But I repeat, if the level of violence doesn't drop off, if the arms continue to come in from Havana or from Managua, and there is a civil war to overthrow a reform-minded revolutionary government, we will stay with the Salvadorian people and government as long as they want us.
The ambassador has said that one of the factors that will permit election is that, in the eyes of the U.S. government, the opposition guerrillas had already been practically defeated. But then Dean Hinton goes on to say that the elections, after all, may not be so free and democratic because of the fact that the government has lost control of parts of its national territory to the very same guerrillas.
And I am hopeful that by the time elections are scheduled next March, that it will be sufficiently under control so that elections can indeed proceed in relative tranquility. Now, I agree with you that the guerrillas are very strong in some parts of the country, like Morazan and Chalatenango, and it may be that there will be small, limited areas of the country where elections will not be possible. We'll just have to wait and see. I am not one who can foresee easily the course of the Civil War. But I certainly don't think you can find a quote of mine that says that I believe it is almost over.
As the ambassador hints, and as other foreign press reports confirm, the guerrillas of the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front control vast sectors of the rural provinces of Morazan and Chalatenango. Pacifica spoke to Miguel Monserrat of the El Salvador Human Rights Commission, and he said it is precisely the strength of the guerrillas and the support they find among the rural population, among the peasants, that has led the Salvadorian government to carry out large ground attacks and aerial bombardments against the peasants in an attempt to dry up support for the guerrillas.
The Salvadorian army was making big military operation in the area of the border. So all those refugees were peasants, all of them, and were just threatened by the army. I mean, they knew that if they were going to stay in the village, they were mostly going to be killed, because they perfectly knew about the methods that the Salvadorian government is using in its counter-insurgency war. That means bombing, that means from helicopters and planes, that means bombing with cannons and mortars to villages, and that means also trying to eliminate what the government consider as being the political basis of the guerrilla in the countryside. This is the peasantry.
One of the most outspoken voices against the Salvadorian and U.S. government's policies has been that of the Catholic Archdiocese of San Salvador. Archbishop Oscar Arnolfo Romero, who had become a symbol of resistance to the regime, in fact was gunned down while saying Mass in the spring of 1980. But his work continues with the Archdiocese Legal Aid Office. The director of that church office, Roberto Cuellar, agrees with the Salvador Human Rights Commission and speaks of the effects that the aerial bombardments have had on the population.
Los bombardeos a finales de 1980 afectaron seriamente a la población civil. Starting in the latter part of 1980, the bombardments began to seriously affect the civilian population. The armed forces and Air Force began their strikes unannounced. And this, of course, was aimed at the civilian population. I think that most of the population has already fled the rural areas under attack. In the last 4 months of 1980, we registered approximately 4,000 victims of these bombardments, and that's why we have this phenomenon of the refugees leaving the country and the misplacement of thousands of people inside the country. These people are flooding the refugee camps being operated by the church and the humanitarian organizations like the Green Cross.
The massive military campaigns conducted in the countryside, described by both the Human Rights Commission and the Archdiocese Legal Aid Office, have, according to those agencies, caused the mass immigration of hundreds of thousands of Salvadorians from their homeland, many of them seeking refuge across the border in Honduras, others traveling as far as the United States. And while Ambassador Dean Hinton concedes that the repressive military operations might be one factor in causing such mass immigration, the ambassador prefers to point the finger at overpopulation as the main cause.
One of the basic facts about El Salvador is the tremendous population pressure on the land. The population density in relation to arable land is the highest in continental Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. There's some islands in the Caribbean with higher population densities. And for the past 20 or 30 years, there has been immigration from San Salvador into Central America, into the United States, south to Panama. Now, I think myself that it has increased in the last few years, because there's no question where you have a civil war, where you have a high degree of violence, where you have terrorism, where you have now a very weak economic situation, people, if they can, many of them will try to move on. Now, refugees and displaced persons as a result of the war, I don't know what the numbers are of refugee camps outside of Salvador. I don't think that they're all that large. They're in the tens of thousands, which is not good. And within El Salvador, there's something now like 150,000 Salvadoranians that are in displaced persons camps, people who have had to flee from zones of insurgent or military activity.
During its first year in power, the Salvadorian military junta was accused by Amnesty International of killing more than 10,000 civilian opponents. The El Salvador Human Rights Commission says the figure is closer to 13,000. But the problem of human rights in El Salvador didn't come to the attention of U.S. public opinion until last December 4th. On that day, the raped and mutilated bodies of 4 American women missionaries were found in a shallow grave near the capital of San Salvador. They had been reported missing 2 days earlier. The U.S. government was forced to suspend all military aid. A presidential panel flew to El Salvador to investigate and then returned to Washington. It said that the press reports claiming that the military itself was involved in the murders may have been true. Under U.S. pressure, the Salvadorian junta was reorganized. A civilian by the name of José Napoleon Duarte was appointed president by the military. Ironically, at the same time, the few remaining moderate military men were squeezed out of power. The new Christian Democratic president promised he would get to the bottom of the murders. 12 days after the bodies of the 4 missionaries were uncovered, the United States resumed military aid. The next month, it was doubled. But with President Duarte, a bona fide Christian Democrat now in the presidency, the United States could assure its own population and the world as well that our new allies were committed to improving human rights, so that another incident like the rape murder of the nuns and missionaries would never occur again. Roberto Cuellar of the Catholic Legal Aid Office.
Es deber del socorro jurídico plantear objetivamente los datos
The duty of the Legal Aid Office is to publicize objective facts of the situation, independent of whether the U.S. Embassy wants to recognize those facts or ignore them. We continue our work and have here the latest reports. From January 15th of this year till June 15th, I can tell you that these figures that we have gathered were just broadcast last week by Vatican Radio in Rome. And as I was saying, from January through May, we can document 8,316 killings by the security forces, a large number of these peasants. Ironically, it's the peasants who are supposed to be benefiting from the government's agrarian reform. But we show 3,665 peasants murdered just in that period, and we show 1,054 deaths taking place during curfew hours, when only the armed forces are allowed out. These murders were also perpetrated by the death squads, who most of the time are accompanied by soldiers. These victims were taken out of their homes and and executed or decapitated.
Nosotros hemos registrado la cantidad de 1,054 asesinados.
The American ambassador, Hinton, made some declarations in the month of June about improvements. He can say he's been in El Salvador only since May. Well, we can tell you, the ambassador, this, that just between June 1st and June 15th, our office has reported 475 deaths, most of them peasants, but also students, workers, and teachers, and businessmen. And we have also registered 100 cases of people killed during the curfew hours. And most alarming, most of these victims have been decapitated. And remember, only the security forces are allowed to circulate during the curfew.
The repression in El Salvador is very heavy. The Human Rights Commission of El Salvador has counted for the first month of this year, that means January, February, March, and April, like 7,800 people being killed by security forces and the army.
That's about, 60 a day or something?
That's about even more than 60 a day. And even the information we get as Human Rights Commission is very limited. I mean, the main information we get are coming from the newspapers, if you read newspapers from El Salvador, every day you have a whole page about the bodies being found that day in the streets of the main cities of the country, like San Salvador, San Miguel, or Santa Ana. And when the government says they were all guerrillas, it's if they actually were all guerrillas, there won't be any more guerrilla in the country. From January 1980 to the end of April 81, there have been exactly more than 20,000 people being killed. There's the point that if you say now, if they're killing 7 or close to 8,000 people in 4 months, in 1 year, they will kill 24,000 people. 24,000 people in El Salvador, it's something 0.5% of the total population of the country. That would be like killing 1 million people in the United States.
Yo le digo una cosa, que estas cifras, estos datos objetivos son parciales.
Let's be clear. These figures are only partial ones because they affect only the deaths that the Legal Aid Office can document. I think there are many more deaths in the countryside, and we only register the murders we fully document. I want to remind the U.S. government that since the coup of 1979 and the installation of power of the new junta, we have registered up till March 1981 800 cases of people who disappeared after being arrested. This contrasts sharply with the 14 previous years of military rule, where we documented 205 cases of disappearance. In other words, the 4 previous regimes that the U.S. said violated human rights were responsible for 205 disappearances, while this U.S.-supported government is responsible for 800 disappearances.
Del general Romero, del general Fidel Sánchez Hernández
Many of the killings and murders in El Salvador have been carried out by the Escuadrones de la Muerte, the paramilitary death squads. The U.S. ambassador claims that the death squads are independent right-wing groups that operate beyond the control of the government, but that President Duarte is committed to putting an end to their activity. Montserrat of the Human Rights Commission.
The question of talking about the government of El Salvador trying to control its own security forces, for us it's close to a joke, if you can allow me that word, because what we think is that the security forces, who's controlling who? I mean, for us, Duarte and the Christian Democrats, as we can see what's happening daily in El Salvador, are not really ruling the country. The people ruling the country are the military, and Duarte and its Christian Democrats are just being using as a front for the outside, mainly for the American conception, I guess. And the military are ruling the country, and the military are the people responsible, directly responsible of the repression, and directly responsible of the actuation of the security forces. That is, namely, the Minister of Defense, Coronel Garcia. Death squads, as something independent, doesn't exist in El Salvador. Death squads in El Salvador are actually composed by National Guards and National Police, and also sometimes by people from Orden, which is a kind of rightish organization used as a popular base for the army, and under the orders of officers of the army, the National Guard or the National Police, and non-rightish people. But they actually are composed by National Guards, and sometimes, National Guards doing extra hours of work after the daily 8 hours job. I don't know how, sometimes they may be too tired to take out their uniforms, so they just act as Escuadrón de la Muerte in plain National Guard uniforms, or somebody being captured by National Guards in plain uniform would be found dead with a sign around the neck saying Escuadrón de la Muerte.
Bueno, lamentablemente hemos comprobado que en la mayoría de acciones.
Well, unfortunately, we have proven that in almost every case where the paramilitary groups or death squads have violated human rights, they have been accompanied by the armed forces.
La protección o la coordinación del Ejército Nacional Salvadoreño.
This was the case in the murders of the leaders of the Democratic Revolutionary Front and in the killing of Archbishop Romero. Our church legal aid office has documented at least 400 actions where the right-wing squads have received direct support from the security forces. If the government wants to get rid of the death squads, it would have to purge the armed forces and police. Unfortunately, when soldiers are found working in the death squads, like in the case of the shooting of 27 civilians in Monte Carmelo on April 7th, the worst thing that happens is that they are expelled from the army. This really gives the license to continue the activities.
Lamentablemente, las sanciones que ellos dicen que son acreedores.
Up till now, only one soldier connected with these groups has been arrested, and that in connection with the murder of 2 American agrarian reform advisors. So only when Americans are the victims of aggression does the United States State Department exert any pressure to make arrests. So of the more than 15,000 murders carried out between last year and March of this year, the government has arrested only one soldier accused of being in the death squads, and this is the only arrest for the killing of all of these civilians.
Efectivamente, cuando hay presiones de parte del gobierno norteamericano para que se descubran a estos responsables.
In fact, in April of 1981, 6 members of the National Guard were finally arrested for the murder of the American missionaries. But no word has come on who they are and what will happen to them. The New York Times reported that a section of the Salvadorian Armed Forces had even tried to block their arrests.
The government wouldn't say anything about it. That's it. I mean, the news was given in the outside in the United States a long time before it was given in El Salvador. The thing is that the government says, well, they are arrested, they are under custody and those guys normally had to be processed, had to be in front of a trial. and that should be in the hands of the common justice, I mean the regular justice. And when I left the country, as far as we knew, all the paperwork had to be done by the common tribunals had not been done. That means that the case still had not been remitted to the common tribunals.
One barometer of the degree of political repression in El Salvador is the number of refugees that are fleeing the country. Many of them, as mentioned earlier, go to neighboring Honduras, where they then face the hostility of another pro-U.S. military regime. When Pacifica Radio spoke to Miguel Monserrat of the Human Rights Commission, he had just returned from a visit with Salvadoran refugees in Honduras. He explains their fears and their motivation for leaving the country.
They will talk half an hour, 1 hour about all the people they knew who have been killed. They will talk about how they had been living in the hills around the villages for 14 months. Because there was no conditions for them to stay at night in the house, because the army could come, or the National Guard, or the commandos, what they call the commandos, which are the American-trained special Salvadorian troops in San Francisco, Gotera, Morazan, would come in the house and take them away. So they were sleeping every night in the mountains, in the hills around the village, for 14 months. What those peasants told me, that in January, at the end of November, there was a big military operation in this area, and that they had to leave the area. They couldn't stand anymore. So what happened is they traveled, walking, 3 days, or 4 days, or even sometimes more, going from one village to another, all the time avoiding the village itself and the roads, walking through the mountains. And from every village or every area, a few hundred peasants would travel north, and they would join like 3,000 of them, or more, close to the border of Honduras. And then they would decide to cross the border to look for refuge in Honduras by groups.
One crossing into Honduras that brought a good deal of media attention in the United States occurred on March 16th, 17th, and 18th of 1981. More than 3,000 Salvadorian peasants, running from aerial bombardments and military operations, tried to ford the Lempa River that separates El Salvador from Honduras.
For what I know is that on the 17th of March, that only day 4,000 crossed the border. Well, you have to know that in that area, the border between El Salvador and Honduras, more exactly the border between the department of Chalatenango of Cabañas in El Salvador and the department of Lempira in Honduras, is made by the Rio Lempa, the river Lempa, which is a big river. It's the biggest river of the country in El Salvador. And those refugees had to cross the river swimming, and they were being chased by helicopters and mortar shells from the Salvadoran army. And they had to cross the river under the fire of those helicopters and those mortars. Well, there were mainly old people, women, breastfeeding children, and many children in themselves, very few men. And they had to cross the river, and the crossing of the river was a very dramatic situation because of the helicopters shooting in them, because of the bombing of the mortars. You also have to know that those mortars were not only shelling the river or the Salvadorian side of the river, but were also shelling the Honduran side of the river. That means that Salvadorian mortar was shelling actually the Honduran territory, without the Honduran government doing any protest or whatever. The fact is that it has been denounced. There has been a close cooperation or collaboration between the Honduran and Salvadorian governments on this point. It means that the day before all the refugees started to cross, in the morning the refugees started to cross, the Honduran troop who was staying in the village of La Virtud moved out of the village and went along the border, just to prevent refugees or Salvadorian campesinos to cross the river. But they could not watch all the area because there were very few of them. So what the campesinos, what the peasants did, they just crossed the river at a point where there was no soldier. And that makes the Honduran soldiers very angry, because they had received order to prevent the peasants to cross. But the peasants did cross. So they were kind of mad. They had a feeling of having failed, and first they behaved really badly with the refugees. And so I've heard testimonies from peasants, I've heard testimonies also from American people who were working in that area, social workers and also priests, and who were just at the river when the campesinos crossed, and one of them went into the river and helped the kids to cross and the mother to swim across, and so. You also have to know that now, and at that time too, the rainy season was starting in El Salvador, and that the peasants of that area, they live in the mountains and they don't know how to swim, and it has been raining the days before and the waters of the river were high, so quite a few of them were actually drowned or taken away by the current of the river.
It was because of that incident on the Rio Lempa that ABC News finally broke the story on the massacre of Salvadorian peasants. Reporter Alex Dressler of the San Diego Union witnessed the crossing and said he counted at least 8 dead himself. Miguel Monserrat says the figure, however, was a good deal higher. Is there any indication or statistics of how many of the peasants were killed in the bombardments as they crossed?
I could not give you any exact figure because nobody exactly knows. I mean, people who saw the thing and social workers on the Iranian side of the border actually do talk about a massacre. But I would say, for what I've heard and what I've talked with the people and the estimates, and so I would say that maybe 100 Salvadorian peasants died in the days, because it was not only one day, in the days of the crossing of the river.
But the U.S. ambassador to El Salvador, Dean Hinton, is skeptical about the reports of this so-called massacre at the Rio Lempa.
Well, I've heard various accounts of the incident I suppose you're referring to. And I don't know what the truth is. And I'm not sure that one can find the truth by interviewing individual Salvadoranians. There are other stories about that incident. Some of the other stories would give more weight to the allegation that active guerrilla forces were being pursued and that there were armed guerrillas who were also going into Honduras at that time. Both of these accounts, from whichever standpoint, do indicate that there was activity, air activity over the river, and that people were killed. What brought it about and how you describe it to the world is hard to say. Unless you were there yourself, if you rely on hearsay evidence, whether it is from those people who think that the government forces were engaged in legitimate military activity, or whether it is from Salvadoranians who may or may not be guerrillas who are trying to present a picture of the horrors of war, and they are horrible, in a somewhat partial form, I just don't know.
The U.S. ambassador warns against hearsay evidence. Father Robert Gallagher is a Jesuit priest from Brooklyn. He works in Honduras aiding the refugees, and he was present at the time of the Rio Lempa crossing. His testimony, given to Pacifica Radio in the La Virtud refugee camps, directly contradicts the ambassador's skepticism.
Approximately 3,500 refugees fleeing from Salvador tried to cross the river into Honduras to seek refuge. When they finally got to the border and were trying to get through the river, most of them couldn't even swim. A helicopter from Salvador started bombing them. We fortunately got reports of it, the Caritas staff here, or Catholic Charities staff, and the staff got down there, sent word to me, and I was able to get down there with some other people, because most of the people couldn't even swim, and we just had brigades of people going across, picking up the people, putting them on our backs and swimming across. There were only 2 ropes between the 2 sides of the river, and frayed. As a result, the process of moving the people was terrible. And throughout this whole thing, there's helicopters coming over and shooting, machine gunning, and mortars and all sorts of things. It was a horrible scene. Again, this would be typical, and the people just don't know when is something like this going to happen again. And we can't guarantee in any way, shape, or form that it will not happen again. The level of security of the people, the refugees, on the border is 0. there is no security.
U.S. Ambassador Hinton told Pacifica he is not only dubious about the reports regarding the Rio Lempa crossing, but also questions the allegations made by the Human Rights Commission and the Catholic Archdiocese. He doesn't so much dispute the figures offered, but rather centers his attacks on the organizations themselves.
I have seen some publications by one of these groups on, quote, deaths from repression, and they claim that 100% of the violence comes from the government or the right, which is just manifestly absurd. And I would suggest that one has got to look behind these groups, which assume such names as Socorro Jurídico or Human Rights Commission, and see what their real links are and whether or not they couldn't just conceivably be propaganda organizations for some group in the society.
Roberto Cuellar of the Legal Aid Office says the only organization behind his Socorro Jurídico is the Catholic Church.
El Socorro Jurídico es un servicio jurídico.
The Legal Aid Office was founded in 1975 to investigate human rights violations. It was founded by 10 Catholic lawyers.
Un grupo de 10 abogados católicos. In
1977, Archbishop Oscar Romero decided to make our office the official human rights office of the Catholic Church, and I had the honor and privilege of working with the Archbishop. And it is in his tradition that we continue to work for human rights and social justice, and in favor of Christians and the poor of El Salvador.
Notwithstanding the doubts raised in regard to the Legal Aid Office by the U.S. Ambassador, the present Archbishop of San Salvador, Monsignor Riva y Damas, continues to recognize the Legal Aid Office as the official human rights watchdog of the Catholic Church. And while Riva y Damas has taken a more moderate position than Archbishop Romero in regard to the right of the poor to rebel, he has been just as adamant in calling for an end to all U.S. military assistance to the Salvadorian junta. American Jesuit priest Robert Gallagher, the one who works in those camps in Honduras, also expresses dismay at U.S. policy in Central America.
Very unfortunate, very sad role. We have such an opportunity, so much power, and an awful lot of good people in the United States, but are being duped into another Vietnam type of situation. The more money that the United States pours into arms in Salvador, the less chances there are for a peaceful, negotiated peace. And it seems 20 more helicopters are going to be coming in, and more arms, not just into Salvador, but also into Honduras. So the Reagan administration is saying to us down in Latin America is that the only way to develop Latin America is through arms. And it's utterly ridiculous. I think we've learned that in our past history, like I mentioned in Vietnam. The only way that the situation in Salvador is possibly going to come to a peaceful conclusion is if people get down to the table, start working together to deal with the real issues. And the real issues are lack of justice, lack of human rights, and a horrible distribution of wealth. And giving arms so that people can kill one another is just prolonging, putting off the day, the most important day, and the only day that's going to make any kind of a change, when people sit down and say, we've got to change. We cannot live in the type of situations we have, where some people have everything, an oligarchy, and others have nothing. That has to change.
President Reagan, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, and Ambassador Hinton, however, argue that the U.S. presence in El Salvador is necessary and beneficial. It is, they say, a stabilizing and moderate force, one that is trying to build a center ground between the extreme right and the extreme left, and at the same time providing a line of defense against what Ronald Reagan called communist subversion in our hemisphere. Hence, U.S. military and economic assistance to El Salvador for the fiscal years 1981-82 and 82-83 is projected at over $250 million. Accompanying that are more than 50 U.S. military advisors. And while a number of press reports have said that the U.S. military personnel, including Green Berets, are playing a central role in mapping out the Salvadorian government's counterinsurgency program, Ambassador Hinton says they are fulfilling only a secondary role, except in the symbolic sense.
Well, some of them, I think, have done a remarkable job in such areas as repair of coastal patrol boats, which are essential for the interruption of arms shipments across the Gulf of Fonseca. With the help of American mechanics and trainers, those boats are back in action. The trainers here have also done well with maintenance people at the helicopter airbase. They have helped on various other activities. We've just had a medical survey team in the country. And of course, they have engaged in the rear areas in some small unit training. That seems to be appreciated. There's so few trainers that it's hard for me to be sure what effect this will have, except that I think they symbolize and are welcomed by the hard-pressed Salvadorian army as a symbol that the United States is a friend in time of need.
Roberto Cuellar of the Church Legal Aid Office says the U.S. ambassador is wrong thinking that the United States is aiding El Salvador by providing arms and Green Berets. Cuellar blames the United States for having supported for a half-century a string of military regimes that blocked not only opposition political activity, but also the economic and cultural development of El Salvador. Cuellar accuses the ambassador and the U.S. government of hypocrisy in claiming that the U.S. is providing a center ground against terrorism of the right and left.
Si yo quiero ser claro en este sentido, en este punto, nosotros no podemos perder la objetividad también.
I want to be clear about this. We can't lose our objectivity. I agree with the U.S. State Department that all the violence doesn't come from just the armed forces, police, National Guard, and death squads. The guerrillas also engage in violence. That's obvious. But the important thing is to trace the causes of this violence. Why this violence? I think the only terrorism we have experienced in El Salvador since 1979 is the economic, social, and political terrorism financed, planned, organized, and assisted by the United States.
Yo creo que el único terrorismo que hemos conocido en El Salvador hasta 1979 ha sido el terrorismo económico, social y político, avalado, apoyado, entrenado, educado por los Estados Unidos.
It's very comfortable for the U.S. to sit back and label the desperate actions of people tired of hunger and injustice as terrorism. Our people have exhausted every peaceful channel, trying to effect some changes before declaring themselves in rebellion.
Hambre y de reclamos de derechos sociales y políticos de un pueblo.
For the U.S. government, it's very easy to equate terrorism of the left and right. But I repeat, the right-wing terrorism has been financed, organized, and planned by the United States. We have lived through years of official terrorism conceived at the highest levels of the government in Washington. That's the only terrorism that we Salvadorians have been forced with. The State Department isn't fighting against that terrorism. The United States isn't fighting against that terrorism. And the Reagan administration isn't upset about that terrorism. In fact, it needs to use that terrorism to defend its interests in Central America and all of Latin America. As I've said before, the real enemies of peace don't live in our continent. The real enemies of peace live in the continent to the north of us.
Intereses en el área centroamericana y en toda Latinoamérica. Una vez lo dije yo, Los verdaderos enemigos de la paz no están en nuestro continente. Los verdaderos enemigos de la paz están en el norte de nuestro continente.
Pacifica Radio would like to thank the following organizations and people who in one way or another have collaborated in the making of this program. The Legal Aid Office of the Archdiocese of San Salvador, the El Salvador Human Rights Commission, the Maryknoll Sisters, Managua, Nicaragua, the Ecumenical Council of Development and National Emergency of Honduras, the Catholic Relief Service of Tegucigalpa, Honduras, Renato Camarda, Ann Daly, and Tony Cavan. This program was recorded in San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, Mexico City, and Los Angeles in June and July 1981. El Salvador, It Isn't Really War was produced by Marc Cooper for Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles.
Hay que empuñar, miliciano combatiente, aguerrido compañero, a ocupar las posiciones, caramba, hasta triunfar. ¡Revolución o muerte! ¡El pueblo armado vencerá! Y una rabia en la mirada y odio profundo para el opresor. Y una rabia en la mirada y odio profundo para el opresor. La insurrección de las masas, su tarea es orientar, combatir al enemigo y a los esbirros castigar. Combatir al enemigo y a los esbirros castigar. No hay que abandonar la casa, el sembrado, la guitarra, pero llegado el momento, las armas hay que empuñar. Miliciano combatiente, aguerrido compañero, a ocupar las posiciones, caramba, hasta triunfar.
For information about obtaining copies of this program, please write the Pacifica Program Service, 5316 Venice Boulevard, Los Angeles, California, 90019.